All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for JavaScript 6th edition, the Web Warrior series by Vodnik and Gosselin. We're up to Chapter 6 of 12. Chapter 6 is on JavaScript form validation. And it may not look like much because we only have 3 objectives: enhance form usability with JavaScript, create custom browser-based HTML validation, and implement custom validation to check for errors and display error messages, but it's a lot. Why? Because anytime you go out to the internet and you go out to a website and they ask you to register for something or buy something, or you put something in a cart or whatever, okay, some kind of validation will have to be done. If I go out to Amazon and I want to buy something, they're going to go and ask me for my credit card information unless I've saved it in something like PayPal. But let's say they ask me for my credit card information. And let's say that I transpose 2 numbers in my card. The validation should come through and should be able to check and say, basically, that's not your card. All right, so validation involves checking that the form information provided by users conforms to rules and is correct. The form object, as mentioned, represents a form in an HTML document. The form object then is used to access the form and its associated data. Now, a few of the things that are in here. Notice autocomplete. You may or may not have used autocomplete before, but it's turned on by default. If you've ever created your own form, for example, and you go in and you put your name in there, and you put in your first name and you hit tab and it fills in most or all of the rest of the fields. That's what autocomplete did. So if you turn autocomplete to off, or you set it to off, or I guess it's to false, it won't do that. The elements are an array of the elements that are in the form. The length is the number of elements. The no validate is important because what that does is the no validate shows what's going to show on the screen to a user who does not have JavaScript enabled. The submit method fires when you click the submit button. Check validity, as it says there, initiates browser-based validation of form controls. And if everything is validated, it returns true. Otherwise, it returns false. And as it says, submits a form without having to use a button. Kind of dangerous, there can be. Common elements for collecting form data. You've seen these. In earlier chapters, we created a form with input elements like text elements, etc. The select we used with option for when we set up the state before. We did a text area earlier where we put a comments section in there. And we've done buttons, submit buttons, reset buttons, or our own buttons. These different elements can have the properties that you see here associated with them. Autofocus. When the form is loaded, whatever the autofocus is set to, it'll go right to there. Now, most people equate that with the first element in a form. May or may not be. Placeholder, we've looked at placeholder text. That's an HTML5 attribute. Required, to make sure that if you don't fill in something, the field that's required, and you press the submit button, you get an error message. Validation message, which I've used, but with some degree of success. Sets or returns the text of a message to be displayed to the user after you fail to submit. Validity returns true if the control passes the browser validation rules, and false otherwise. Value, if it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign, it returns the value of a control. If it's on the left-hand side, it sets the value of a control. Will validate returns true if the validation has been enabled for the control. Check validity, as it says, runs constraint validation against a form element. Set custom validity allows you to basically do some of your own customization. We've talked about blur when you leave one control and go to another. A blur event fires on the control you're leaving. A focus on the control you're going to. The change event, if I came in and I had, for example, a text field, so I said type Input type equal text, and I put my name in there, Jeffrey, which has 7 letters in it. 7 change events would fire. 1 each time I entered a new letter. Form change, form input, I don't know if we're going to even look at these. Input, the value of current or selected item of the current element changes, and invalid if something is found to be invalid. Now, to bring this kind of into context, as mentioned here, we're able to use this stuff with getElementsByTagName. All right? And the document object includes a forms array, so you are able to programmatically go in and manipulate a form. Why would you want to do that? Well, if a user leaves off one or more required fields, you might want to handle it in different ways. You might want the field to turn red, or you might want to have a message in red to the right of it, or something similar to that. So the elements array contains objects representing each control in the form. When you validate a form on the client side before you send it to the server, it reduces the amount of validation necessary for the server. All right? You can also, on the client side, improve form usability. You replace input boxes with checkboxes or drop-down lists. If you remember earlier, we had that program where we asked the user to enter a 1 if they were a small, a 2 if they were a medium, and a 3 if they were large. What if instead of doing that, we had a drop-down list with 1, 2, or 3 in it? Then they couldn't put in an illegal value, for example. When you design forms to collect more accurate information, these are things you want to think about using. Sometimes you have no choice. You can't have option buttons, checkboxes, etc. for someone's name. But if it's, for example, if you're asking them the department they work in, it's much easier to present them with a list of choices as opposed to expecting them to type it in and not make any mistakes. So we set this up, and it's set up totally with text boxes. Here we've reset it, and we use radio buttons for the card type. The card number is kept the same. The expiration date, we now have date pickers, or date controls, and the CVV is the same. You can't really, there's so much variety in card number and CVV that those have to remain basically as text elements. When you do this and you provide assistance, you reduce the likelihood of user errors. You prevent users from entering erroneous information on purpose or accidentally. All right? You might want to set default values. I showed you that in the form we did where I defaulted the state to Missouri. If the selected index is set to -1, that means nothing has been selected. So if you select the first option in a list, it's option 0. Remember, we're computer people, so we start counting with 0. You can set the length. You oftentimes do this. You might set the length of, for example, of all your text boxes, so they're all the same length. Multiple, so you can maybe select multiple options at once. Selected index, which is again has got the index starting at 0 with whatever you selected. Dynamically updating select list values. You can add or remove option elements using node methods. Okay, so maybe over time, when you ask a person the best way to reach you. All right, it used to be you'd have, for example, USPS mail, and then they added phone, then they might have added email. Now they might, for instance, they might later come in and add Facebook. And that might be something you can add by putting in a new node. Some properties of option elements, I'm not going to read these. But again, when they say to increase content accuracy, you want to make it as hard as possible for someone to screw up when they're filling something out. Adding placeholder text for older browsers. The placeholder is supported by modern browsers, but if you want to put it in for older browsers, you can add placeholder text yourself. programmatically using JavaScript. Again, automatically updating an associated field based on a user entry. Okay? So for instance, maybe you ask a person whether they're part-time or full-time. And if they say part-time, you're done. If they say full-time, then they provide insurance information. You know, if we assume that part-time employees don't get insurance and full-time do. Transferring duplicate fields. This is a real popular one. All right, if I click the button, it says, so if I fill in all my billing address, and if I click the button here that says same as billing address, it fills in those fields for me automatically, which just makes sense. Why make the user do double work? Modern browsers perform some validation. It can be done through the browser itself. It can be done through HTML5. You can also do it through JavaScript. Notice there's a max length field, and you typically put that into, for example, a text box, and that's the largest number of characters you can put into it. You can have min and max, oftentimes done with a number field. You know, you've seen that where it asks how many pages do you want to, or how many copies do you want to make. And you, for instance, if you had 5 people, and you might want to make a copy for 1 of them, 2 of them, 3 of them, 4 of them, or all 5, the min would be 1 and the max would be 5. All right, patterns we looked at a little bit before for some regular expression stuff. Required we've looked at before also. Step, basically when you've got a number field, by default it'll step up by 1. Maybe you want it to step up by 100 and you want the values to be 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. All right, other things that you can do, you can specify browser-based validation parameters as mentioned right here. Modern browsers display feedback in similar ways, but they might look a little bit different. The feedback, as it says, will be displayed after the submit event is triggered. Invalid controls could be highlighted with a color. All right, there could be a bubble next to the first control that's wrong. You saw all this when we went through the form earlier. This is customizable. These are some of the things that you can set. Again, not enough time in the day to read what each one of these are. So you can create check validity and set custom validity methods to do whatever it is you want to have done. Notice for CSS there's invalid pseudo classes to change the properties of form elements depending on their status. So for instance, if I ask you for your salary, and let's say your salary must be between 0 because you're a volunteer and 100,000 because that's the max salary. So if you put in a value that's between 0 and 100,000, you would have the valid pseudo class kick in, and maybe that value would appear as green. Whereas if you put in a number less than 0 or a number greater than 1,000, the CSS invalid pseudo class would kick in, and maybe it would become red. All right, here's an example of customization. Some of this, if you're using HTML5 forms, will happen for you automatically. But the kind of problem with this is sometimes you don't want it to say, please fill out this field. You want it to say something else. All right, so you can customize what gets said there. As it says, that bubble appearance varies among browsers. You can't set multiple messages for the same field at one time. You can use the prevent default method to keep something from happening. For instance, maybe you've got on a form, maybe you've got some kind of a hyperlink in there that will send you someplace, but you don't want to, or maybe allow you to view some extra information, but you can't view that information until you've signed up and everything on your screen is validated. So you could use a prevent default which checked, and if your form had not validated, you could prevent the default, which would mean, boom, you can click the hyperlink, but nothing will happen. If you disable something, typically you must provide custom validation. So here are common validation types of things. Make sure that all required fields are filled in. Fill in any field that's dependent on another field, and check for content type. Salary, I mentioned to you before, that would have to be numeric. The submit button fires as mentioned here when the form is submitted. Typically when the submit button is selected, but it doesn't have to be. Data is usually validated when the submit event fires. Again, you can use prevent default to keep something from happening. So what are we doing here? Well, we're actually using, if you remember from an earlier chapter, we're using try catch, which is exception handling methods, which says if you're looking for a value and it's empty, you can throw a message to make sure something happens or doesn't happen. Checking for empty input text fields, again, there's different ways that you can do this. We'll look at some of this stuff after we get done with the lecture here, in our next lecture. So here, if you say selected index is -1, you didn't select anything. And there's different ways that can be done. Sometimes you'll check for 0. Maybe you've seen that with a state where they say, rather than the first state being Alabama, the first entry in your select list says, please enter a valid state. So that would be actually value 0. So you could check, and if that was 0, you could give them a message that they didn't select the state yet. You can check for option buttons with no selection. Okay? There's a lot of different ways this stuff can be done. Sometimes, as it says, you need to test the logic specific to a form. You can validate based on all sorts of things. Validate based on a checkbox. Remember before we said let's assume, let's go back for a ways, and let's assume that in here, come on, we're going to get there. There. Let's assume that all of these fields are required, every one of them. And you've only filled in, you left out the zip code, and you click the same as billing address. You could have the system go back and check this first and send you back here saying you didn't enter a zip code before it would allow the stuff to be copied over. Just as an example, again, there are a multiple number of ways in which this stuff can be used. So here, did you fill out all fields, etc. So there's a lot of different ways that this stuff can potentially be used. You can check for fields to make sure they're numeric. You can check to make sure that patterns are followed. We did look at these before. So in this chapter, we discussed JavaScript form validation. We talked about how to enhance form usability with JavaScript. We talked about how to customize browser-based HTML validation and how to implement custom validation. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to again go back to W3 Schools as we were at before. I'm going to type in here W3 Schools Java. We'll try JavaScript and see if it has this. JavaScript form validation. All right. JavaScript form validation. So these are both the same site, it looks like. And again, we'll run through this. All right, we'll run through an example, and I want to look at this and the next example or examples in a little more depth and breadth of coverage. So I'm going to stop this lecture, and I'll continue on in a couple minutes.